Great. Okay. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. My name is Ras Nabil, and I am a research associate at the Research Society of International Law, and I'm based in Lahore. I'm a LUMS graduate. I graduated in 2021 from the law school, and I went on to do my LLM from the University of Cambridge the following year, and I have now been working here as an international law specialist for the past 2 years. And this session is just to introduce you all to some of the key legal writing and research skills that will be useful for you while you're still at LUMS, and also aage jaake if you're interested in a career in legal research, or obviously when you enter firm practice or litigation, these tips will obviously be useful there as well. So RSIL is the leading legal think tank in Pakistan, and we conduct research and analysis on international law and its intersection with domestic law and policy. We also build capacity in the understanding and further study of international law at Pakistani state institutions, private institutions, as well as academic institutions. We also work in research-driven legislative drafting, law reform, policy making, consultancy, and advisory services. So we're pretty multifaceted and quite a diverse organization, and we try and work to improve Pakistan's understanding of international law, and also beyond just understanding Pakistan's implementation of international law. Because again, as you all will know, international law is only as productive or as effective as its implementation is, and where the state may not have the necessary capacity to conduct or such implementation, that's where we come in. So our research areas are the following. You'll see that we do work in a lot of various areas, and there will be some overlap with domestic law, particularly when we talk about criminal justice sector reform and human rights, and also the environment. Our work is primarily to use our research of international law and how international law is implemented in, for example, other states, and see what Pakistan can do in terms of developing its own legislation, or developing certain institutions, rules, or regulations to sort of adopt those international best practices into our own jurisdiction. So these are just some of our centers and initiatives. You'll see that they align quite neatly with our research areas. Our conflict law center is perhaps the most well-known, where we conduct research on international humanitarian law and law of armed conflict. You'll see a lot of our content very recently on the Gaza and Israel war. We also have a Center for Human Rights, a Center for Criminal Justice Reform and Capacity Building, which is another big center of ours. We've recently launched the Climate and Environment Initiative, which looks at the law of the environment and climate change, and Global Governance Initiative as well. Apart from that, we have the Data Lab, which works on data analysis and data-driven decision-making, and PORT, which is a trade law research initiative. So just before I move forward, I know that a lot of you will also have questions in terms of the careers that you want to pursue, perhaps in international law. And these are just some of the ones that I came up with. Obviously, I'm an international lawyer, but I'm also a legal and policy analyst. So these, and I'm also an academic. So these roles are not necessarily operating in silos. तो आप इन सबको मतलब simultaneously भी कर सकते हैं, and a lot of people do. But these are just some of the ways in which you can pursue a career in international law. And I know that obviously the majority of the law batches are more interested in going into litigation or corporate practice. But it's promising to see that a lot more people are coming up to us and saying that, hey, we want to pursue a career in international law. Can you guide us? This is sort of improvement or the changes we want to see moving forward. That international law is respected as a worthy career option for law students entering LUMS and also other academic institutions as well. So now let's move forward with legal writing and research skills. I've broken this up into first looking at writing and then research. So these tips, obviously, you will see some overlap. You will also see that most of this has been taught to you already at your writing and communication classes, and your if you're a junior law student, then definitely um, uh, in your legal writing and research methods classes as well. So key writing advice. I think before the writing process itself is it should be very methodical. It should be very, very well thought out. And in order to do that, you need to have a few things in mind. So 4 things you need to be absolutely certain of before you actually start the writing process include your audience. Who are you writing for? What is the final platform in which your written piece is actually going to go up to? Uh, what is the sort of knowledge base of your final audience? Because obviously, people who are better versed in international law will understand an article that uses a lot of legal jargon much better than someone who is, just browsing a series of blogs or a newspaper article that is sort of explaining the basics of international law. So ये आपको ज़हन में रखना चाहिए कि आप किसके लिए लिख रहे हैं और आपका पीस कहाँ actually publish होगा. Next is your concepts. You need to be really clear, and I'm not speaking about legal concepts. I'm speaking also about, international law, for example, works really well with other areas of, for example, international relations. You need to be clear on the things like what's going on in the world, if it's current affairs issues. So you need to have your concepts clear. And then you obviously need to have your law clear. You'd be really surprised to see that so many people confuse important and very critical concepts in international law because they've not done their proper research, and they do not exhibit that understanding that should be exhibited in, for example, a journal article or a blog post, and it should be shown in your writing that you know the law inside and out. You know your case law, you know the treaty that you're citing, you know the statutes that you're citing. So that's also very important. And finally, of course, is your argument. What exactly are you trying to say? If I have to read a 2000 word piece, by the end of it, I should be very clear on what you're trying to get me to believe. ठीक है? If at the end I'm like, okay, मैंने सारा पढ़ लिया है, but मुझे अभी तक समझ नहीं आ रहा है कहना क्या चाह रहे हैं, that's obviously a red flag, and you want to avoid that. So you need to be clear on what you want to argue from the outset before you actually open that Microsoft Word document. ठीक है? Another key piece of advice is to keep rereading and revising as you go along. Don't wait right until the end where you have this absolutely hot mess of an article, which is, which has all sorts of references that make no sense whatsoever. So as you finish a paragraph, I would advise you at least revise that paragraph once, then you move on to the next one. Once you finish a section or like a subheading or whatever you want to call it, you would read that first before progressing to the next stage. And then obviously at the end, you would revise everything after you've written your conclusion. And then if possible, you would get a second opinion as well. One key piece of advice again is to plan out your essay to the T. Okay, you need to make sure you have your sub-arguments outlined. You need to make sure you have your references outlined, and you need to make sure you have logical structure of your essay very clear in your own head and obviously on that Microsoft Word document before you start to flesh out your ideas. Because अक्सर ये होता है कि when we start just writing from scratch without a plan, it's all over the place. कभी कभार हमारी paragraphs एक दूसरे से contradict कर रही होती हैं. ठीक है, so you need to be very clear with a plan, and then you set your writing targets, which is how much you want to complete by a certain amount of time or by a certain deadline, just so that you are well phased out and you're not leaving everything right until the end, which is, what many people tend to do. So I'm advising you to not do that. Again, just to sort of make a long story short, these are some of the things that you should and should not do when you are writing a piece of academic literature, and not only just legal, but if you're going into social sciences, even the natural sciences, these are the things that you need to bear in mind. So you should be keeping it brief, keep it as succinct as possible, succinct, sorry, and keep it concise. Do not drag on your points. Do not use very long sentences, and definitely do not use very long paragraphs. Okay, space it out. Just make sure that your ideas are straightforward and concise. You again would need to plan ahead, like I've spoken, and I would say a big no-no is pulling an all-nighter. When I was at LAMS, I never pulled an all-nighter to finish an assignment, okay? And it fared quite well for me, alhamdulillah. So I would advise you all to also not pull an all-nighter, rather phase out your research, phase out the writing process. Once you receive the prompt or once you receive the essay, you should already be starting to think about how do I plan this or how do I structure this essay and what sources I need to look at. Do not leave things right until the end. I know it's very tempting, and I know कि बहुत सारी deadlines एकदम से आ जाती हैं, but you need to be disciplined in your approach. You will need to regularly proofread and perfect your grammar, and I would advise against relying solely on your Microsoft Word spell checker or things like Grammarly वगैरह. Obviously, they're really useful and they do make life easier, but they do not always provide you the best suggestions or alternatives in all circumstances. So I would say आप एक दफा पढ़ लो properly and then see whether the grammar needs to be revised and to what extent.
इधर भी पूरा इसमें तो कुछ छोड़ा नहीं है.
I'm just going to mute whoever said that. Again, another key piece of advice is to use active voice. So look at the example here and look at the example in the passive voice column. You will see that even though they try to say the same thing, the way they say it is very different and it has a different effect. So when you're writing something, use the active voice unless you absolutely need to use the passive voice and where the passive voice seems appropriate. Again, you would need to use formal and professional language. Keep your tone as neutral as possible. A lot of times we get submissions that are very emotionally charged, and we can tell that you feel very strongly about a certain point, and that's very good to see that you believe strongly about something. But in academic writing, you need to come across as very formal, as very neutral, and very disciplined in your approach so that it actually becomes more convincing and you present it more factually rather than emotionally, if that makes sense. Use short sentences, like I said before. We get sentences that are sometimes longer than paragraphs. So you need to keep it succinct, keep it brief, and just get your idea across in the least amount of words as possible. Yeah, similar to that is to get straight to the point and use certain language. अक्सर हमारी writing में होता है कि it should be noted that, it appears to be that, it seems that, etc., etc. And what that does is it reduces the level of certainty that comes across in your writing. And obviously, at times, this can be okay. I mean, at times it can be acceptable. But ideally, you should be getting straight to the point and removing it should be noted that it appears to be that type of language. Just get straight to what you're actually trying to say. Hanya, you have your hand up?
Yes,
Yeah, only very slightly. If you can speak louder, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. So I just had a small question. You mentioned that we should remove phrases like it should be noted that and similar phrases, and it does make sense. But then if we do that, how do we make it clear to the reader that the thing that I'm trying to say, for example, in an essay, is based on my own analysis or understanding and is not a fact? Like if I don't wish to phrase it like a fact because it's like a analysis point, so like how do I differentiate that?
Let me go back to the slide. So if you can give me an example, I think that'd be best. For example, यहाँ लिखा हुआ है, it should be noted that whatever you say after it should be noted that should be where you start. Just remove it. It should be noted that, or it appears to be that. You don't need that. It's absolutely unnecessary, and it's just an addition of words that does not strengthen your argument, but rather it reduces the validity or reduces the strength of your argument. आपका काम ये है कि आप you are presenting information to me in a manner that I believe your side, right? And you can only do that if I am convinced that you're certain in your perspective. Yes, at times it can be okay, but you don't need to use it excessively, right?
Okay,
at
so
times,
like,
if you can say there is a if there is a debate around a certain topic, that's completely okay, and it's fair to use that. But I'm saying that when you're analyzing something, don't come across as if you are uncertain about what you're trying to say. You need to come across as very certain, as very clear on your concepts, so that the reader is like, okay, this is what I am believing, and this is the train of thought that I'm going to be following, if that makes sense.
Okay, so like just follow up. Is it okay, like for example, such introductory phrases and then go on to say what I want to say with full certainty and then don't give a citation because it is like something that I have inferred from my reading of, for example, a legal provision or something similar. So like, do I need to give a citation for that?
I mean, you would need to cite wherever you're asserting something factual.
Yeah,
But
but it's not factual, it's like
analytical
analysis.
points, yeah, analytical points don't need to be cited. Whether you use it should
Okay,
be noted that or not. That doesn't
okay,
matter.
okay.
All right, so I'm going to move on. Key writing concepts, again, just building on to a lot of things that I've already said. Accuracy is obviously the first one. Constantly fact check, constantly ensure you are clear on your concepts, okay? And make sure that if, for example, you are referring to someone else's opinion or someone else's commentary, that you accurately portray what they're trying to say as well. Clarity, as I mentioned, this can be achieved when you properly plan out your argument and you ensure that each point or each paragraph of your essay moves logically from the previous one and onto the next one. Simplicity, use very simple language, straightforward, be concise, and try and maintain the same structure throughout so that you're not using a variety of writing styles or writing techniques. Just keep it simple, just get your point across, which leads me to the next point, which is conciseness. To get your point across in the briefest sort of manner. If, for example, the word count is 2,500 to 3,000 words, your aim should be to keep it as close to 2,500 words as possible. And I say this as someone who used to ask instructors to please increase the word count just for me because I had a lot of things to say. Try and keep it as brief as possible. You'll notice a very stark difference in the quality of your writing if you try and reduce your word count as opposed to trying to increase it. Oftentimes, when you try to increase it, what we're doing is we're using a lot of repetition and we're saying the same thing over and over again to try and emphasize our point, but actually it's doing us harm. Okay? So you need to be concise, and you can ensure that by using short sentences and small paragraphs, not page-long paragraphs, 3, 4, 5 lines. Usse zyada I would advise against. So structure to your writing is very important, and I would say it's probably the most important element when it comes to argumentative writing. Okay? You need to ensure that your argument comes across, and your argument will only come across well if it is structured well. Okay? Obviously, the research counts, but how you present that research, how clearly and how logically you present that research will have an impact on how the reader is going to buy what you're saying. Okay? So in your essay plan, you will need to identify your research question, what exactly you are conducting research on, your thesis statement, what your proposed sort of answers to that research question are, and your overall conclusion. You will need to, when you are planning out your essay, pick out your evidence down to the page and paragraph number. So wherever you are picking out sources, note down the page and the paragraph number. Ideally, quote the line and add the page and paragraph number so that it makes it easier for you to then cite it while you're writing it out, but also you know exactly where you've picked out a certain point from. Okay? And finally, you will need to find and address potential shortcomings in your argument right at the planning stage. If you've come up with an idea for an essay and you've looked at the research and you've planned out an argument in your head and it's now on paper and you feel like it's not coming across as well, and you think that, for example, one element of your argument can be easily challenged by the reader, or you've not addressed counter arguments properly. That's the part this is the stage when you try and preempt that. This is the stage where you try and say, okay, I found this, let me now try and address it so that when I write it out, I'm not in deeper trouble and I've saved myself from going down a rabbit hole of additional information, counter arguments, etc., that maybe I can avoid at this stage. Okay? the ideal structure for a paragraph, and then obviously for the larger essay, is as follows. You would start out with your point. What is the basic sort of factual or analytical points that you're trying to make? Okay? I have an example in the next slide, so we'll go over it in greater detail there. The next point would be your evidence. So here's where you bring in your research. Okay? And then you explain how that evidence, that piece of evidence, backs up what your point is trying to say. And then overall, you will relate that back to the research question that was highlighted either at the start of your essay or while you were planning. And obviously, you may not necessarily include your research question in the essay, but you will sort of answer it in a thesis statement. So you would relate it back to your thesis statement as well. So I have an example here. I just want you to take like 2 minutes to read this through. Okay? The research question is above, and we'll explain how this is sort of the ideal structure. Okay? Just take your time. Okay, so the question is very clear. This is an area of international humanitarian law or the law of armed conflict. And it's asking how are civilians or people who are not participating in the conflict itself, how are they protected? So the points that I'm trying to make is that, okay, under IHL, there is something that we call the principle of distinction. This is the point that I'm trying to make. And I'm trying to say that this principle of distinction protects civilians during hostilities. How does it do so? I have now provided evidence. And the evidence is Article 48 of Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions, which is a treaty, okay? And it states that parties to a conflict must at all times distinguish between the civilian population and combatants during an armed conflict. Then I've also provided another piece of evidence, another article, that states that the civilian population shall not be the object of attack. So that means civilians cannot be made the target of an attack. So a soldier cannot point a rifle directly to a civilian while there is an armed conflict going on. That's what it basically means. So I say that now that because of these two rules, it is incumbent upon parties to a conflict to always first distinguish between who is a civilian and who is a combatant, and to then only target combatants and not civilians. So because of these rules, because of this evidence that I've picked up, this evidence explains my point. And it says that now the principle of distinction under IHL protects civilians from being targeted, from being direct targets of attacks during an armed conflict. I've broken it up in simpler terms here. So the blue is the point. This is what I'm trying to say. I've given 2 examples. You can give as many examples as you feel necessary. So it doesn't have to be like PEER. It can be PEEEER also. That's completely fine. And so the green are the examples. The pink is my explanation of how the evidence backs up my point. And then overall, I've related it back to the question. How does IHL protect civilians? IHL protects civilians through the principle of distinction, which protects civilians from being direct targets of attacks during an armed conflict. So this is the sort of ideal structure that you should be aiming for in your paragraphs. And you will also notice that I was straight to the point. I didn't use very flowery language. I didn't use, it should be noted that, it seems that, etc., etc. This is my opinion. This is the law that I've looked at. And this is my logical deduction from whatever my research has shown. Does this make sense, or are there any questions before I move on? Okay, I'm going to move on then. Now let's move on to research. So when you start your research, you will obviously need to give yourself enough time to read up on the subject. And by reading up, I don't mean you necessarily have to read every single word of like 10, 20 different articles. Skimming is fine. And skimming is fine as long as you get the main gist or the main points of what that particular author is trying to say. And you would then, after doing that research, you would then develop a research question. And you would need to develop research questions which are focused. Okay, so they're limited to one single problem or issue. They're not very broad. Because once it's broad, your research quality becomes very diluted, और फिर आपकी overall quality बहुत कम हो जाती है. Obviously, you need to pick something that is researchable and something that you can easily find research on, whether that is a primary source or a secondary source. It needs to be something that you can answer within the time frame and the practical constraints, and so it has to be feasible for you. Okay, so if you have 10 days to the deadline, you're obviously not going to try and develop a whole new regime of international law. You're going to pick a certain area that you find interesting, or you find that there may be something to explore here, and you would focus into that so that you're able to answer within that amount of time. The question also has to be specific enough, and I think this is where a lot of people come into problems. They have very broad ideas of what they want to argue, and for example, some people say, is international law even law? And that's a very broad question. You would have to look at very specific areas of international law, which you would say, okay, maybe this is where the comparison with domestic law is not fruitful, or is not an effective strategy. So it has to be very specific to help you develop a high quality piece of academic writing. It needs to be complex and arguable enough to develop the answer of the space of the paper or the thesis. Okay? I think this is pretty straightforward. It has to be something that actually is not a very it has to be something that is not as straightforwardly answerable as maybe some other issues are, and it has to be something that generates debate and something that generates intrigue. And finally, it has to be relevant and original to your field of study and or society more broadly. And I think this is also pretty straightforward. So these are just some of the things you need to come up with when you're these are some of the things you need to bear in mind, I apologize, when you're coming up with a research question to start off your research. You will also need to make use of a variety of sources, and I've highlighted them on the screen here. Okay? And you would need to ensure your sources are authoritative, factually correct, and up to date. A lot of times you get people who cite out of date material, and especially with international law, things keep changing all the time. So you need to make sure that your sources are up to date. They also need to be authoritative. We cannot only rely on student run blogs to write a whole academic thesis. You need to use more weighty or more credible sources, like with established academics or primary sources such as case law and judgments, as opposed to using less credible sources, so that your own argument is given that credibility overall. Then the next step would be to conduct a literature review. But before that, I just want you to take a look at the slide, the graph here. And you will see that you need to find the right balance between the depth of treatment, like which academic sources engage with a certain subject with more depth, versus the breadth of coverage. How wide do you want to how wide is the topic that you actually want to explore? You'll see that law journal articles are probably the best ones to refer to, because they look at a very narrow area of law, and they pick out a very specific problem or a specific point of intrigue, and they will look at it in great depth. As opposed to a legal dictionary, which obviously you're not going to rely solely upon when you conduct your research, but you will see the difference here. And this obviously has a great impact on the overall credibility of your essay as well. Then the next step would be a literature review. I know not all courses and definitely not all publications need a literature review, but it's good at least to have it for your own sake, so that you know आगे के लिए मैंने like what other areas within my research do I actually need to focus on? Okay, so just some questions when conducting literature review. What question or problem is the author addressing? What are the key concepts and how are they defined by this particular author? Obviously, they can be different, there can be multiple interpretations as well. What are the key theories, models, and methods? Again, this is maybe more specific for quantitative research, but also for qualitative, which is primarily what legal research is. What are the results and conclusions of the study? How does this relate to other literature in the field? And does it confirm, add to, or challenge established knowledge? Obviously, some publications will try to go against the grain. And so you need to be very clear about what the author is actually trying to argue before accepting what they try to say. Especially with this era of disinformation and misinformation, you need to be very critical when approaching certain research sources because they can be very biased and they can seek to propagate a particular idea without properly backing it up with evidence. So you need to be very cautious about the sort of sources you refer to here, and what are the strengths and weaknesses of the existing research, and what weaknesses can you then target in your own research. Sorry. Okay. Yeah. Few more research tips to be meticulous and thorough. This means that you cannot just find 3 articles on JSTOR. They look good and they sound good, so those are the only ones you're going to use throughout. You obviously need to thoroughly research the field, look at multiple sources before you decide on which ones you're going to refer to, and note down the citations when planning your draft, as I mentioned. And while you're drafting, make sure you cite as you write. अक्सर ये होता है कि हम कहते हैं कि हम end में cite करेंगे, and what often tends to happen is that people forget the sources that they refer to, or they forgot to mention them under a particular footnote, and then everything is a mess. Okay? So these are some things to think about as well. Use mixed research methods if necessary. Again, maybe for legal research, it's not as necessary, but referring to surveys and referring to like census data and other forms of data analysis can be really useful when you write legal analysis as well. Especially at the literature review stage, you would identify gaps in the research. So those are the gaps that your piece is actually trying to fill, and plan on how you're going to fill in these gaps. If you cannot find information online or in publications, for example, you would then approach experts in the field and you would conduct interviews or surveys, focus groups, take care. If there is data, you would conduct data analysis. I know maybe not necessarily as lawyers, but this is something that you can think about as well. I think they already teach you this in law school, but whenever you read a judgment, saath make a fire act, the facts, issues, rule, application, and conclusion structure. It makes it much more digestible for you when you're conducting research to not have to comb through the whole judgment, which can be 100 pages long. Highlight the relevant paragraphs, highlight the relevant analysis by the judge, and make sure you have that stored in your plan so that at the writing stage it can be much easier for you. And lastly would be to fact check and ensure your research is up to date. I cannot stress this enough. A lot of people come up with bogus arguments based on very loosely researched sources. So you need to make sure that whatever you're saying is factually correct, especially your citations. A lot of people also cite the wrong paragraphs when referring to judgments and refer to the wrong judgments overall. So you need to be very clear and very accurate when it comes to your citations and your research as well. These are just some research tips that you can take a screenshot of this, and that's perfectly fine. We basically conducted a research workshop for the Air Force, which is why the examples here are Air Force related. But these are some tips that you can take when you're conducting online research, particularly on Google and Google Scholar, and it will help sort of comb out the sources that you're actually looking for. A lot of people don't really know how to conduct basic search engine searches. And so these tips hopefully will help you moving forward with that. So I'll give you some time to quickly grab a screenshot. And then I think that's pretty much it. Thank you for your time. I apologize for the technical difficulties before, but I appreciate everyone joining the meeting here. And I'm now open for questions and comments. there appear to be none, which is fine. Yeah, the slides can be shared, no worries. So I'll forward it to Aisha and she can share them again. Yeah, Hassan?
Yes, hello, is my voice audible?
Yes.
All right, so firstly, thank you so much for the session. Honestly, it was really beneficial. And I had a question about the structure you talked about earlier as well. Although you mentioned like the proper structure, the tier structure, but still, like whenever we write, we tend to discover a lot of other options that we have while writing in terms of structure as well. So I'm very confused sometimes about the structure. Like, should we start from like a general approach and then become specific, or should we start right from stating our fact and then like expand on it and become like make our statements general? So like this general specific divide always confuses me. So would you like to add on to it?
Acha. Sorry, I think my internet's a bit, yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, it's fine.
Just give me 1 sec. Am I audible now?
Yes, you're audible.
All right.
Yeah.
The general specific divide, I think, especially in your writing and communication class, you were taught to start off general, especially in the introduction, then move to specific. I would say that's where that divide ends. आप generally topic introduce करोगे, but then you're going to obviously hone down and focus in on one particular area within that broader topic that you are going to argue in this essay. So structure wise, I think the peer structure obviously is not the only structure, and I completely understand that. But it is the easiest one, and it's also the one where and it's also the one which is sort of most easily understood from a logical perspective. उसके through आपकी जो argument है बड़ी logically structured होती है, and that makes your argument far more believable and more obviously much stronger as opposed to other structures. तो मैं तो यही recommend करूँगा. It's worked for me great, and I think a lot of lawyers and a lot of legal researchers will also agree that this works really well. And you'll also see that the IRAC structure, when you look at it, is also pretty much the peer structure just adapted to case law. तो मैं यही कहूँगा कि it starts off generally in the introduction, but उसके बाद you would then keep your research restricted to the specific questions that you are answering. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so exactly this was something I confronted like in a couple of my recent courses. So what happened was that I started off with like a general explanation of what I want to write in my introductory paragraph. And this is, as you rightly mentioned, that we've been taught this in the writing and communication. But the instructors were like, they told me that you're just wasting these 3, 4, 5 lines and you're not exactly conveying the point what you want to write. Like, so their instructions were that you need to be specific right from the first paragraph. You know, like we are usually taught that you need to give a context before you go on to the explanation. So they were like, you don't need to give lengthy context for like your specific idea. It just like wastes the time of the reader. So this is something I really get confused.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. You don't need to give lengthy context. Like 1 or 2 sentences is more than enough. Then just move on to what you're discussing.
But still,
So yeah,
context is useful.
obviously context is useful because context explains why you're actually conducting this research in the first place. Without that, you're not going to be able to establish the need for this research. But that should not take up more than 1 or 2 lines. And maybe if there is a section for the literature review, that's where you add that in. But otherwise, you would just add, there is a paucity of research on, the implementation of best practices in human rights law in Pakistan. This essay seeks to suggest ways in which best practices in human rights can be implemented through the following ways. Khatam. That's it. It doesn't need to be a whole paragraph. It doesn't need to be a whole page. It can be very limited.
All right. Thank you so much.
No worries. Bakhtaur?
Hi, I'm a senior right now, and we've gone over these guidelines many times. However, reinforcement is always beneficial. Thank you for your time. I was more interested in in your career landscape and the conversation you had earlier about career options in international law. And as someone who is graduating soon and looking to immediately go for grad school, can you please give some tips or just advice on how to get started with grad school apps, focusing on majoring in some special researching in international law when I go for my grad school. That's what I want to work on more. So,
Okay, as someone who went right after their undergrad for an LLM, I would advise you very strongly to not do that. I would advise you to take a year or two after graduation to work and then apply for grad school. I think you will get a much different experience and a much different sort of I think you will definitely get a much different experience as opposed to if you go directly after LLB. When I went, I was still in student mindset, so I approached it very much as a student would. But as someone but other people who've practiced for a while, they will approach it from both a student lens but also a practitioner's lens. And I think that will provide you a much better sort of experience. I do understand that for some people, it's better to get the padhai done ek hi dafa, and some people are very sure, like I was very sure about the career move that I wanted to do, and I knew the difficulties. Like I knew that, for example, it's very difficult to get a job right after graduation, even with an LLM in international law, and that's just the nature of the job market, especially if you're applying by it. You need to be well aware that the job markets in other countries are not designed for Pakistanis. They're not designed to take in expats, especially as lawyers, because you need to be locally qualified or licensed to enter a firm and to earn that salary in the first place. So I would say speak to some faculty advisors as well. They will also say the same thing. मैं थोड़ा rebellious हो गया था, and I was like, चलो ठीक है, let me just apply for the sake of applying. If I get in, I get in, and then we'll figure out how to get there. तो ये हो गया था, alhamdulillah. I think I have zero regrets, but I would say it'll give you a much more unique perspective when you approach grad school, and it will also give you better chances of funding, take care for scholarships, definitely, and also if you're looking to settle abroad, which I know a lot of people are, and I'm, not surprised. I would say that work experience will actually help you in your job applications over there. So this would be my advice regarding that.
all right, that's really helpful. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Anya says, do you have any tips for planning out the research phase of new project? If I have a research question, I'm aiming for qualitative research only. Should I begin with shortlisting texts? Yeah, I would say just read up on the subject. Just obviously have a research question in mind before you start reading up on the subject. You may find that it's been done to death and there's a lot already written on the subject, so you don't want to sort of regurgitate the same things that have already been said. Try and find unique ways to work around that research topic that you have in mind. So yeah, I would say you don't need to even shortlist text. Just do a very cursory search online and just start reading whatever comes up first, and then you'll have an idea of what's being said on the subject, and then you'll argue from there. You'll just read up more about it. Any more questions? No, that's it. I think we're good to go. Aisha, your call.
I think that's it. If anyone has any other questions, please let us know. I don't think so anyone has a question. Thank you, Ras, for such an insightful session. It was really wonderful, and I'm sure the students who have attended would have benefited a lot from it. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you everyone for taking out your time. Thank you. Thank you. Lafis. Take care.
Hafiz.